have a number of experts here with us to represent ICANN, IETF, IEEE, and the ITU, all of the ISTAR organizations. And we're going to maximize the time available. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Mallory Nolan to introduce herself and the rest of the panelists.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of Updates on ISTAR Organizations from the Bullshit Police. We're going to talk a little bit about what has been going on in the last couple of years, since it's been 2 years since we did this session last time. We're just experts that participate in these ISTAR organizations, not necessarily representing them, but we will try to do our best to update you on the most interesting things happening at ICANN, IETF, IEEE, and ITU. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves. We're just going to do round the table on what everybody is seeing that might be of interest. And while you're listening, you can type your questions into Matrix, and we'll make sure to get to them if we have time at the end. So I'm going to first turn it over to Amelia. Go right ahead.
Why, thank you. My name is Amelia Andersdotter. I currently work for the Council of National Top-Level Domain Registries in Europe, or Centre. But I have previously worked for Article 19, a London-based human rights organization covering human rights and privacy and security issues in the IEEE 802 Landman Standards Committee, or the group which is responsible for Ethernet and Wi-Fi standardization in the world. And so even though the title of this session is Bullshit Police, I must say that by and large, the IEEE 802 community is delivering on the promise of stronger privacy protections and security efforts at the lowest level of technologies. So just recently, a month ago, a general framework for assessing privacy properties of 802 standards was passed to RevCom, which is like the final step of approval in the IEEE SA before you have a standard. And that means we'll have an objective kind of community developed framework within which to assess whether engineers are putting security and privacy features into the layer 1 and layer 2 standards for chips, for networking, and for bridge networks. So that's very exciting. There's also been a bunch of other ideas cropping up in the IEEE 802 community about how to enhance security and privacy properties for end users. So one of them is being able to indicate policies directly in beacons or management frames with privacy policy indicator bits. So this would be like a bit that you could flip on and off in a management frame, depending on whether you're open to negotiating a particular privacy infringement with the network you're associating to. A very interesting development currently being discussed is a more systematic approach to packet padding. And some of the audience which has been listening or following Tor developments might recognize packet padding as a strong anonymizing feature in network traffic, because it makes it more difficult to profile encrypted traffic based on varying packet lengths. Now, unfortunately, it probably cannot be used for all connections because it also has a lot of overhead. But the IEEE 802 group is looking at ways of making it more easily accessible to more network operators. And so that's just extremely exciting. There's some parallel work at the IETF as well, but I will not preempt DKG's future exploration of IETF advances as well. So I think that's about it. I don't need to do more of a, if anyone has any question on IEEE 802 and their privacy work, I'm fine to respond to them later. But broadly speaking, good news from the IEEE 802 front. Our electrical and electronic engineers are doing what they can to ensure that we have the best technologies available to us for protecting our privacy.
I can take the next stab here. So my name is Daniel Kahn Gilmore, or DKG. I am a technologist at the American Civil Liberties Union within the ACLU's Speech Privacy and Technology Project. I'm going to speak here mainly about the IETF, which I've been actively involved in. That's the Internet Engineering Task Force, the folks who are responsible for the RFC series, defining internet standards anywhere from TCP to sort of higher level standards like calendaring systems and email and web transport work. The IETF has done, so in a couple of years since we've done this session, there's been quite a bit of work at the IETF, some of it good, some of it troubling. One of the big focuses at the IETF has been thinking about how we reduce the metadata footprint of the protocols, what information we leave on the wire. This is a long-term project, and there's lots of multiple little pieces. Amelia spoke about packet padding, which is a good anonymizing technique, but is only useful if the metadata isn't actually on the wire directly. So some of the metadata that we're trying to cut down on are things like the DNS, the domain name system, which is traditionally in the clear. When you make a TLS connection, the secure tunnel that HTTPS uses, and also the same kind of handshake that's used for QUIC, which is a new transport that's being used for the web beyond TLS. Those TLS handshakes themselves leak information about what the name of the server is that's being contacted. The DNS packets are widely used for censorship and filtering. And so protecting the privacy of the DNS removes one hook. The privacy is closely related to your ability to speak freely online, because without being able to identify, the censorship is much harder to enact. But there's a juggling act here. The DNS leaks information about what you're looking up, the names you're looking up, and the TLS handshake leaks information about what you're actually connecting to. And those travel through potentially different routes on the network. We've had problems many years ago getting either of those problems to be worked on because each one could point at the other one and say, well, why should I bother fixing the DNS because TLS is leaking? Why should I bother fixing TLS because the DNS is leaking? We've seen action on both of those fronts now, so that's the good news. The good news is we have two different protocols for protecting the privacy of DNS queries, DOT and DOH. DOT is DNS over TLS and DOH is DNS over HTTPS. There's some subtle differences between the two. Classic IETF fashion is delivering two things to solve a problem and then leaving everyone else to figure out what exactly to do, which one to choose. So it's not as straightforward as it was before, and your queries are likely not currently protected by DOH or DOT unless you are using Firefox, or you're using an Android handset and you've configured it to use a resolver that offers DOT. But the fact is, some people have their DNS queries protected today on the network, and that means that we've moved to focus on the TLS handshake. The TLS handshake has server name indication, which is the biggest leak. Multiple attempts to fix the server name indication leak have met with some sort of scattered success, but the process now is actually looking at encrypting the entire first packet that's sent, what's called the client hello in TLS. So if you're interested in this, you should look at the encrypted client hello work that's being done. And for the DNS, part of the difficulty with the DNS is figuring out how do we protect those queries, those DNS queries. And so there's a bunch of active work right now called adaptive DNS discovery, which is a total sort of scattered disaster. We don't exactly know how clients are expected to configure their machines to receive, to get the benefits of private DNS. There's a bunch of other interesting work that's going on, also metadata reduction work. Some of that is going on in the LAMPS working group. LAMPS covers email and cryptographic certificates. And in the LAMPS group, we're now actively discussing how to cryptographically protect the headers of email. As often happens in the IETF, the work in the IETF is sort of rearguard action. There have been several deployments of cryptographic header protection for email. That is for email that is cryptographically end-to-end protected, like PGP or S-MIME. And the work right now that's going on in the IETF is basically trying to write down what people are doing and figure out how we standardize it in a way that other people can adopt it. Work that you should be worried about that's happening in the IETF is there's a bunch of folks who are interested in figuring out how do we use the IETF process to encourage interaction between the user and the network. And some examples of that in the past have been tools like protocol proposals like SPUD and PLUS, This year, they're calling it network tokens, but you're also seeing it in some of the transport groups. Those groups are actively trying to move metadata from inside encrypted protection to the outside so that the network, charitably, so that the network can optimize traffic and perform better traffic delivery. But often those things are sort of stalking horses for the ability of the network operator to control what happens on the network. So it's worth looking out for that stuff. It happens in a bunch of situations and a bunch of contexts. It's also used to claim that we can use this to better use the network to defend against malware attacks or phishing. And so, you know, if folks are interested, I recommend getting involved in some of the discussions going on at the IETF around that. There's a group that's discussing changes to the threat model that we care about. The traditional internet threat model is the network is hostile. And I think you'll find today that that threat model is more valid than ever. So there's discussions about how we add nuance to that in the face of people using devices that are running code that is itself hostile. But I think if we focus on those devices by claiming that the network is not hostile, we end up losing the game. So I think we need to expand the threat model concerns and not narrow them. So I'll turn it over. I believe Juliana is going to talk next, but happy to see questions in the chat too. Thanks, everybody.
Hello, thank you. My name is Julian Aguerra. I work for an NGO based in Chile, Derechos Digitales, that's working in a Latin American scope. And we've recently started to get more involved in these pure technical issues, trying to work in the intersection of these technologies and human rights, but knowing a lot more of human rights than this kind of technology. So I will not speak about things like Amelia and DKG, but access, because we feel like participating in IETF that access is a very urgent and important issue that in the recent case of the pandemic has been taken central, like a focus in the discussion. So yes, in IETF, in IRTF, exactly, there is a group named Gaia, Global Access for the Internet of All, that has been worked specifically on access, but most of all on infrastructure and broadband, access to broadband infrastructure, peering, and those kinds of issues, more technical, but also recognizing the social and economic context in which these technical issues can be deployed. And that in this version of the IETF, they were talking about environmental sustainability and also how community networks in rural areas in South Africa, for example, have like implemented different strategies to deal with the pandemic situation in rural areas where the industry is not really interested in deploying infrastructure because it's not like and there are not like economic incentives to deploy. So that's a very interesting place to start thinking about the intersection with the right to access and protocols and infrastructure. But also in the case of the pandemics, where every meeting went to virtual, like HOPE, there is a discussion, which it's a long-term discussion, but now it's like in the focus about how to guarantee a successful participation, virtual participation, and decision-making at IETF. And I think there are a lot of interesting things happening around how to, or maybe an opportunity for groups traditionally marginalized, like Latin American people, African developers, and Latin American developers participating actively in spaces like IETF and all these ISTAR organizations, because there are a lot of costs of participating, and it is usually easier to participate in the decision making, like being there, going to the meetings and not participating virtually, even though IETF, I think, have the very best technologies to virtual participation. And just for say something that for me, being in Latin America is very, I think it's amazing, like 400 people interacting virtually in a meeting. For me, it's something that never happens or don't happen anywhere else. And not participating like here, that we are streaming the video and participating in an independent chat, which for me, it's very difficult to follow. But interacting and discussing, actively discussing at the same session, maybe. So that's another discussion. And for example, we, during the pandemic, started discussing a lot, not in IETF, but in other spaces, about WebRTC technologies and how can we access to very quality communication through WebRTC technologies. And in the recent meeting, there were two discussions about how to encrypt. On the other hand, the communications in the application layer, and how to encrypt the RTP, the transport layer header. So this is interesting for us, but I don't really understand what does it mean, because I just think about the software. You know, if you use Zoom or Jitsi or WebEx or Big Blue Button, and that's what I can understand. Not a lot of more of that, but what I understand is that encrypting has an impact on the quality of communication, on the speed of communication. And in countries where there are a lot of broadband and speed and low latency for communications is very different from countries like ours, where we have a lot of difficulties and we have no infrastructure, not good infrastructure. We have electrical problems and other things. So what we are doing now is trying to better understand how different protocols interact in the application and transport layer, and maybe try to participate in these kind of discussions, trying to look for better quality communications, exactly in terms of access, not necessarily in terms of privacy, which is a very interesting and very important issue, but which have attention in this kind of spaces, but in terms of access also, not one or another, but also privacy and access, and good and a success, I don't know, a high quality access to the communications, to the real-time communications in this case. So I think it's a very good opportunity. What is happening on the new group, Stay Home, Meet Only Online, because the people who can travel long trips to go to the face-to-face meetings have to meet online, and they are trying to find the best way to interact and to have all the conversations one can have face-to-face. So if anyone is interested, there is, I think, interesting a discussion on Slack. It is open, and it's about how to continue discussing not only around working groups issues, but others in a centralized or decentralized, federated, what does that mean, and how to have really good meetings, and how to take this opportunity to really get more people and more diverse people involved in this kind of discussions. So for people who have never think it is possible to actively participate or permanently participate in these discussions and meetings, I think this is a new opportunity to stay there in the same conditions to any other people. I don't know if the same quality communications, but yes, everyone virtually. And yes, I think that's all I wanted to share.
Thanks. So I'll pick up next. So again, I'm Mallory Nolan. I didn't introduce myself before, so I'll do that now. I'm the CTO at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm now based in DC, but I also used to work for Article 19. And there we, and still today now, I participate in some of the ISTAR organizations as best I can as a team of one, essentially. So yeah, as was mentioned, the IETF was meeting this week. There have been ongoing meetings for the IEEE as per their usual online meeting, and ICANN also met last month in July. And they're all trying to figure out how to meet online. I think, Juliana, you brought up really important points. But today I drew the short straw, so to speak, and I'm going to talk about ICANN. It's a distinct, it's still an ISTAR organization. It's setting important standards for the global DNS, but it's a lot more around policy development and not really at all technical specifications. The closest you get is that some of the numbering folks interact with the IETF around the back end of how the DNS works. But for the most part, ICANN is a very large, very global, more and more, place to develop policies around the entities, the businesses, the governments that are selling or managing top-level domains or country code top-level domains. And there's a lot that's actually been in the news around ICANN. In fact, I remember distinctly 2 years ago when I was talking a bit about ICANN then and how Whois had basically just gone down because the GDPR went into effect earlier that May in 2018. And Amelia corrected me to say that actually the European data protection law from 15 years ago was ignored by ICANN, and it was only once GDPR came into effect because it included fines that Whois needed to be taken down with a swiftness. And so it has been done. So back in 2008, the update was that ICANN had come up with what they called a temporary specification. So Whois went dark, and then there was basically just a placeholder while they where they installed people that represented the larger ICANN stakeholder community into something called the emergency policy development process. And while you and I might imagine that emergency is like a 911 call, I can tell you with a straight face that it's still not done. The emergency policy development process that was put in place in May 2018 is still continuing its work, although it has produced, since the last time we spoke, something called an interim policy. So the interim policy basically continues the temporary specification, which means that there's still no centralized mechanism for screening requests to Whois, but you can still get Whois data if it's old and it's still relevant. So any data that was about any personal data associated with domain registration records pre-2018 can still be found online because there were loads of mirrors and you basically can just do a search. If you need updated personal data for domain registrants from 2018, you can still get that, but you have to ask for it, and you need to be an important person who asks for it through, I think essentially, which was like an MLAT process for law enforcement. Now the interim policy is sort of codifying that a bit more. So essentially, you can become an accredited user, not necessarily an individual, I suppose, also institutions, that then can get streamlined access to domain registrant data as a whole. So it's not a one-by-one record request. You can get all of it if you're accredited. And we don't know exactly what that looks like because they're, of course, still implementing the interim policy. And then what's next is they are still tasked with coming up with what will be in ICANN policy referred to as the registration data policy. Now that work is ongoing. It's just been sort of renewed and refreshed after the interim policy was agreed upon by the ICANN board. But we probably shouldn't expect that until around a year from now. And even then, it still needs to be implemented. And that'll be a feat, so that it'll take a while. But again, like remembering that WHOIS was kind of a bummer, and we're glad that it's gone, and we are not rushing to replace it with anything. In fact, there's a lot of questions around streamlined data access for law enforcement that the civil society partners and pro-privacy people are still fighting really hard to rein in, so that there's not like just basically a fire hose of personal data that can be gleaned by people who have this sort of accredited streamlined access. Another thing that I might mention, is that also, again, you can imagine that some of the reasons why these policy processes take so long is that ICANN is really trying its best to be a multi-stakeholder space. It could be probably moderated a bit more because you have a lot of special interests that still dominate, and things get gridlocked really easily. I don't even know if there's a whole lot of opposition to this work, but back in 2017 now, there was a high level commitment made by ICANN to value human rights. So to do its best to create its policies in line with a human rights standard across a variety of human rights, such as freedom of expression, most notably, but also privacy, freedom of association, all of that. It's now up to people who are advocating in those spaces to monitor and watch policy as it's developed, to see if the the various entities, the sub-entities within ICANN are actually following process, because it's not also about the outcome of the policy. It's like, is the process of the development, following human rights? So it's a very meta discussion. And I think that's important to follow as the, ICANN sort of has made those commitments itself through running its own human rights impact assessment for the whole of the ICANN organization. And then the idea is that each individual sort of sub-entity, like, the governments that are looking at CCTLDs and things like that, that their processes for policy development are also following human rights. I'll just pause there for a second and say too, that I think it's an important thing for folks who are going to engage on this or thinking about it is, I don't know that we actually need the human rights impact assessment model to hold governments accountable for human rights when we have other UN processes for that, but that's something that ICANN needs to work out. It's probably a lot more direct to go straight to the UN to hold governments accountable, and that trying to do that through ICANN is a bit too oblique and sounds kind of like where some of that advocacy might spin its wheels a bit too much. But remains to be seen. And then just lastly, because I think my time is almost up, I wanted to make sure I addressed a bit of what was also very much in the news this year around the .org sale, which is not really, in my opinion, something that ICANN had to deal with. I mean, ICANN did step in. I think ICANN, listened to a much broader set of concerns from the community than ISOC did, which to its credit, we all appreciate, but it was not necessarily an ICANN issue because the contract between ISOC and ICANN for the ownership of .org was not really in question, right? It was more about what ISOC was going to do with it. And they totally underestimated and did not value enough from the beginning, and still, in my opinion, not today, the concerns of people who hold .org domains and the larger sort of civil society sector, that whether or not .org is their home, felt like they had a stake in it and weren't properly listened to or consulted. So I'm not going to go into that much further. I think this might have been parts of discussions in other sessions in Hope, but from my view, I'm always, of course, happy to talk about it. And one thing I would just like to say, and this is just coming from my opinion, not trying to give you information. I think that one of the problems with the way that the biggest problem, if I could criticize how the sort of Save.org campaign happened, it was just that they called in the California Attorney General to get ICANN involved, which undermines a lot of efforts to try to make ICANN truly global. Like, we don't want to be encouraging the US to get in and arbitrate on various decisions that are going on in ICANN. We really do want the community to be able to handle that. And so I'm just hoping that we don't see more of that. I hope we don't see the Attorney General from California getting involved in a variety of extremely concerning things that are happening in ICANN. We'll just try to do our best to advocate within the policy development community itself, however slow and frustrating that might be. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Mehwish now.
Thanks, Mallory. So my name is Mehwish Ansari. I am head of digital at Article 19, which is an organization you've already heard a couple of times from Mallory and Amelia, so I don't need to intro it too deeply here. I am going to be talking about the ITU, or the International Telecommunication Union. Unlike a lot of the other organizations we've talked about, the ITU is a UN specialized agency, which means that it's intergovernmental and it's mandated to address transnational aspects of telecommunications infrastructure. What's interesting about ITU, and something that we talked about a couple of years ago, is that more and more the ITU is interested in internet-related issues and standardizing them. Up until now, the ITU has largely been dismissed as an internet-related standards body, as is a body that has a lot of clout when we think of internet infrastructure. And that's really because it's been largely ignored by US and European industry. That does not mean that the work coming out of the ITU is not deeply problematic for the impact that it has on internet infrastructure as it's deployed around the world. In terms of updates, really the big news is that the ITU-T, which is the technical standardization sector of the ITU, that's where all of the internet-related standards are developed within the ITU's mandate, is coming up to the end of its 4-year study period cycle. It's technically supposed to be ending in November, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been extended slightly into February of 2021. And that's when the World Telecommunications Standardization Assembly, or the WTSA, is set to meet. This is a really important meeting because it's going to set the mandate and the agenda for the ITU-T over the next 4 years. And that's the meeting that's going to set exactly what issues the ITU-T will be able to address. It's important. It's an important space because, and especially in the last couple of years, we've seen an explosion of really problematic internet-related issues crop up. And this again has to do with some of the things we talked about at the last update that we did, which is the fact that the ITU is not multi-stakeholder, it's really opaque, it's not very transparent, it's dominated by the interests of governments and to a far lesser extent industry, and civil society or public interest representatives are just not represented. In fact, the ITU is quite hostile to input from civil society. And we saw that quite clearly in 2018 at the ITU's highest level conference. That's a treaty level conference called the Plenipotentiary. We tried to advocate for more openness and more multi-stakeholderism at the ITU, and we were unequivocally shot down in the strongest terms possible because, as it turns out, governments are not so interested in having multi-stakeholder input in ITU decision making. So that really makes what we've been seeing in the last couple of years very important because even though US and European industry is not so interested in the ITU as a decision-making space, and it's largely been dismissed, Chinese government and Chinese industry have been really interested in the ITU, and that interest has only grown in the last couple of years. The ITU, because of its position as a UN specialized agency, because of its international clout and the legitimacy that an ITU standard brings in terms of adoption from, particularly from global South governments, is really made it an interesting space for China and its industry to start participating in to a wider degree. So we've seen a lot of really big Chinese industry players spend a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of time in the ITU trying to develop standards for everything from the Internet of Things and smart cities to AI, machine learning, to quantum computing, DLT and blockchain. Really what the interesting thing that we've seen is that these big industry players, I'm talking about Huawei and ZTE, but also the big players like big telecom players like China Unicom, China Mobile, China Telecom, kind of that trinity of telecommunications players that are now developing infrastructure all around Europe and Asia as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, are really focusing on making the ITU the hotbed for standardization of emerging technology issues that they then want to implement as part of developing infrastructure in global South contexts. So the WTSA in that context is really important because the mandate and the guardrails that are going to be set around these issues will determine how standardization in the ITU works for the next 4 years. And we're already seeing the adverse impacts of not having those guardrails in the last couple of years. For example, in study group 16 in the ITUT, we've seen not one, but 3 or 4 different proposals for facial recognition architectures and frameworks that are really problematic because there are absolutely no discussions in place from a user-centric or public interest perspective there, again, because it's multilateral and opaque and it's just governments talking about this. And we've already seen how governments have bungled up discussions around facial recognition technologies. During the last update session, we talked about the digital object architecture, which is this architecture that was being standardized through the ITU as sort of an alternative DNS. In that same vein of trying to find alternative systems, alternative architectures to what we consider the internet, we're seeing the development of what's called new IP in the ITU. It's been quietly developed for a little over a year in the ITUT. It created quite a stir in November because it finally reared its ugly head in the IETF, where a lot of stakeholders finally started paying attention. This is a standardization or standardization effort that's really being led by Huawei. And the proposal is in very early stages in the ITUT, but it's really looking like an architecture for interoperability for heterogeneous networks. And if that sounds familiar to you, it's because it probably is. It's meant to be some kind of a supplanting architecture for what we consider to be IP and the internet as we know it. So obviously, because of the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency in the ITU, and particularly in the ITUT, these kinds of efforts are problematic, and they're only going to grow in nature because of the lack of transparency and accountability that we're seeing there. So I think I'm going to end it there so that we can hand it over for questions. I'll hand it back to Mallory.
Yeah, so that's the plan, is we're going to go into responses to questions, but also responses to each other, because I think that there's a lot of overlap. Well, there's where there's overlap between some of these ISTAR organizations, there's some interesting stuff. And I think we all sort of have a bead on what other folks are doing, and then we can now go a bit deeper by riffing on that. So we're just gonna do the same thing, just a tour of the table, starting with Amelia and going back through. So keep the questions coming. We can do this as many times as we need to until we run out of time. Go ahead.
So I try to be brief in my presentations, but I thought maybe this connects well to what Mehwish was saying on the International Telecommunications Union and the importance of political decision-making at the global level with respect to what networks we have, but also tying into DKG's message of positive engagement in technical standards organizations. And if you want to make use of the fact that there's at least some organizations that are trying to do good things some of the time, what do you do? And so the fact that there are privacy recommendations in the IEEE 802 community, of course, is not so valuable in and of itself. They're just a bunch of nondescript recommendations that are non-mandatory for engineers to comply with or implement. They can serve as guidance for engineers if they want to produce privacy-preserving technologies. But ultimately, the companies that participate in chip standardization, they're very big multinational companies, and they respond to economic incentives. So if one is of the mind that one wants to have stronger privacy protections in the wireless communications equipment that is being deployed for smart cities or in your local mall or your airport or whatever, you need to start thinking about whether there is a way that your local council or your local airport or companies that purchase these network equipment or services from network operators, if they can start requesting implementation or adherence or maybe some kind of checklist from these privacy recommendations. So I think one of the very strong points of the privacy recommendations that are now going into like the final form at IEEE is that they have a checklist in them for what privacy preserving wireless and wired network technologies would look like. So it's like modeled after the IETF document RFC 6973 on privacy recommendations for internet protocols, that you could actually go to, I think it's like class 8, and just check does the technology that I'm trying to purchase fulfill this privacy requirement, the other privacy requirement, and so forth. And if we can get people that put money into network technologies or network technology services to start requesting adherence to that checklist, that will, of course, incentivize the chip vendors to look at the list more closely when they develop new technologies. And in the absence of economic incentives, a lot of the existing privacy work might not pan out positively for networks after all. And so I thought that would be like an important thing to raise. Like the end game is regulatory. So big companies will not be doing good stuff unless they believe that good stuff is profitable for them. And that requires work not only in the technical standards organizations, but also follow-up work outside of the technical standards organizations. So I think DKG might also be able to talk more about stuff like the captive portal standard at the IETF, which is super important and allows network operators not to man in the middle attack their users. And so having more public Wi-Fi providers, airports, malls, all of these entities make use of such technological developments will for sure be very important if we're looking at getting more robust and secure infrastructures for us all. Sorry, I'll end there and see if somebody else wants to.
Go ahead, DKG. We're just going to go down the list, and you can pass or say as much or as little as you want, really.
Sure, yeah. So I want to speak a bit to Amelia's point about the captive portal protocols, and also to some of the questions that we've seen in the chat about naming and some of the issues around the centralized name systems. So captive portal is a great example of one of the really tricky protocol design projects. So the goal of the captive portal group within the IETF is to provide a mechanism that the network operator can use to basically indicate to the user that they need to do something in order to continue on the network. So you've probably all seen this when you've been out traveling, you get onto a network and all of a sudden your browser pops up a web page that you didn't go to, but why is it popping up that web page? So that's being done basically sort of by accident. There are some gaps in some protocols, and the network operator basically intercepts all of your traffic and sort of forces this web page on you. And it's not done in a very well standardized way currently, and it can be pretty sketchy. I've actually documented some attacks you can do with existing implementations where you can, if you know what someone's doing on their computer, you can sort of phish them if they join your network. So the captive portal project tries to define a clear standardized way for the network operator to say, hey, here's something you need to do to continue on the network. Now, there's a spectrum of things you could let the network operator do to your device that run anywhere from extremely constrained things where the network operator really can only get you to acknowledge that you're on their network or something, to arbitrary user interface operations, where the network operator can sort of take over control of your machine as soon as you join the network and what is being shown on the screen of that device. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but I personally prefer the network operator to be more constrained. I would rather they didn't do any of this stuff. But by developing a standard, the goal is to say, hey, stop doing all of the horrible, nasty shit you've been doing and pick up just this particular constrained dialogue, constrained interaction. The balance here is that they're currently doing really bad stuff and they're not actually paying much of a cost for doing it. And if you want them to adopt this other approach, it's not clear what their incentives are. So I think I want to echo what Amelia was saying, which is that, I mean, Amelia, your term is endgame is regulatory. I'm not sure if regulatory, like government regulation, is exactly it, but the financial incentives that you highlighted are really clear. I don't know exactly how we muster that strength, but I hope that folks who are here, who are at HOPE, who are interested in the implications, the social impact of tech, will think about that. If we have this standard available, how do we force folks to use it who otherwise might do even worse things? Real quick, I want to just mention there are questions in the chat about the centralized nature of the domain name system. I will point out that the GNS, that's the GNU naming system, which aims to not have quite the same centralized mechanism and offers some additional protections for queries, is the GNS project has presented at the IETF, has been presenting for the last few times. They're not making much traction within the IETF. And that's in part because of their communication strategy around their technology. So I encourage folks who have thought about standardization and who are interested in these alternate naming strategies to get involved with the standardization process and see how you can help sort of streamline the paths for those projects. We've only got about 5 minutes left and I want to make sure other people have a chance to talk. So I'm going to turn it over to whoever wants to speak next. Juliana?
I can jump in then. I wanted to make two comments. One is just a general comment on about a few things we're seeing. So the things that Mehwish mentioned in the ITU around China's efforts are spilling over into the IETF as well, which is really interesting. So there's one particular set of redesigns of the way the internet works, the IP protocol. They're calling it new IP, and they're really pushing that at the ITU first and foremost. And it's meeting with some resistance because of the issue of mandate creep. One of the ways that it's been able to be kept somewhat within, like under, you know, the lid has been kept on of it is because folks are saying like, this is not the ITU's role, this is for the IETF. So they've come to the IETF now a few times to talk about this idea of redesigning completely the IP stack, which would just create a lot of, you know, opportunities for things like network tokens and things like that. It's just not it's not very user-friendly. Let's just the end user-friendly model of IP. And so they're coming to the IETF, which of course the IETF doesn't really want to work on it either because of all these problems. The IETF is a lot more pro-privacy and thinks about these things a lot more carefully. But there is some value now, though, in perhaps looking at how this work might continue to be discussed in the IETF. Otherwise, it's just going to get kicked back to the ITU. So there's a bit of a delicate balance there. There was this week a meeting at the IETF 108 about what they're calling new IP, but also different acronyms that all kind of mean, you know, the same sort of thing. But I wanted to spend the last few remaining minutes. I hope we'd have time for you as well, Mehwish, to respond. But there's a lot of questions about ICANN. And I just want to reiterate a couple things that may not be super obvious from what I said before. One is that ICANN is policy and it's binding. So unlike the IEEE, the IETF, you know, places where the specifications are really suggestions for implementers of the best practice way to do thing, ICANN creates policy that is contractual for anyone who is managing a top-level domain. That's why the stakes are so high. And also, we have to remember that the alternatives are not great. So something like DOA that Mehwish mentioned before is not ideal. It is compelling and interesting for authoritarians because then they don't have to deal with ICANN, where ICANN is a multi-stakeholder process. So just remembering that when you're thinking about the save.org situation, right? Having one government or one entity controlling this is not the idea. We are explicitly trying to move away from that. That is what the IANA transition was all about, which was an effort that went from like 1998 to very recently, trying to get it so that ICANN is fully independent and that the people and the entities that are engaging in that space are doing so on equal footing, where you don't have the ability for one elected official from one government to be able to come and make changes. I don't think that we have time for much more, but Mehwish, did you have anything to say at the end?
We're unfortunately out of time, Mallory, and thank you so much to you and to all of the panelists for the conversation we've had here today. We're looking forward to having another panel up next. We have the EFF panel, the Ask the EFF panel up in 10 minutes. And so we'd ask everyone at home to continue watching as we put on the bumps and our info beamer, and we'll see you at the top of the hour for Ask the EFF. Thank you very much.